everybody, and thank you for participating in the South Dakota DBE video training lecture series. This is our final training in our 4-part series, and today's training is all about managing contract changes. So change is inevitable in any project. Contract changes are basically amendments to the original scope, schedule, or budget of a project, typically initiated after the project has begun. Managing these changes effectively is crucial for project success. This presentation will delve into the process of managing these contract changes or change orders from initiation through documentation. We'll explore why contract changes occur, the impact of unmanaged changes, the benefits of effective contract change management, and just some best practices for handling them in general. Additionally, we'll discuss some tools, training, and education resources to help empower you in managing these contract changes effectively. So with that, let's dive in. So these are going to be our learning objectives for today. We're going to look at the fundamentals of contract changes. And that's going to entail the impact that these contract changes can have on a project, the different types of changes, and the reasons why these changes may occur in the first place. Then we'll look at the contract change/change order management process. Specifically, we're going to look at some common challenges that will come up and mitigation strategies. Then we'll look at roles and responsibilities of the contract change management process. And then finally, actual applications to control the process. So we'll look at the cost management, time management, legal considerations, and negotiation techniques. So let's begin with, what are contract changes? Contract changes and change orders are formal requests to modify the scope, schedule, or budget of a project. And these can be due to unforeseen circumstances, client requests, design changes, or even regulatory changes. It's important to remember that contract changes can really come from a variety of different sources. They could come from the contract owner, they could come from the agency, they could come from the contractor or the subcontractor themselves, or from an external source. Now, these are important because these changes and being able to effectively adapt to the project requirements ensures project integrity and overall success, maintains or corrects the quality of the project, helps define those outcomes, reduces risks, especially unforeseen risks that could come up, and it enhances communication between all parties. So some impact of these changes, and these can either be good or bad, but a contract change can impact the scope, and this may provide changes that help clarify some desired outcomes by refining the project deliverables. Note of caution here is that it may also add to scope creep and increased workload. And we're going to talk about what scope creep is in a little bit. Could impact the schedule. Change requests often result in project delays due to additional work or adjustments required. Need to adjust milestones and deadlines to incorporate these changes. The cost. Changes often lead to additional expenses beyond the original budget. So we're going to need to reallocate the funds to make sure that we can cover the cost of these changes. And lastly, the quality. Some changes can enhance the overall quality of the project, but there also may be a potential negative impact on quality if changes are rushed or not properly managed. A lot of these changes and impacts are things that you should be considering before you even start a project, maybe even as far back as the quoting, bidding, or estimating phase. So now we're going to look at the different types of contract changes that you're likely to come across during your time. These contract changes can affect the scope, the schedule, cost, technical, legal, personnel, and risk allocation factors involved in a project. For scope, additions and deletions. Additional work or deliverables are requested beyond the original scope of the contract, or vice versa, we remove some of the tasks or requirements from the scope of work that is originally defined in the contract. Scope changes also have a second, third, fourth order effects as they directly impact the rest of the project, such as the schedule and the costs. Speaking of schedule changes, we could be extending our schedule, potentially requesting to extend project deadlines or milestones that may be due to unforeseen circumstances or delays. This could be weather. This could be once you start digging into a construction site, you realize there's something underground, archaeological finds, piping that wasn't first noticed by the engineers. Unforeseen circumstances that may delay the process. On the other hand, we may want to accelerate the process. So an urgent request to expedite project activities to meet even tighter deadlines. Could also be cost changes. Price adjustments, such as changes to the contract price due to variations in the cost of labor, materials, or other factors. Price changes can definitely be impacted by political environment, geographical environment, things like COVID and global pandemics drastically change supply chain channels as well as costs as well. Or even just things such as inflation could have changed the price of materials, especially for longer projects that span over several months or years. There could also be cost reductions, negotiated reductions in contract costs without compromising quality or performance. Technical changes, specifications modifications. So any alterations to a technical spec or requirement that's outlined in the contract. And this is going to most of the time result in a different scope or different deliverables that you're going to need to execute. Or design changes, revisions to project design or engineering plans to accommodate new requirements or address issues. If you're a subcontractor, you're really not going to have any say over design changes in most circumstances. So you're at the mercy of the engineers, whether they're DOT or another government agency doing these design changes, and you just have to have the strategy for how you're going to adapt to that as it relates to cost and scheduling. There could also be legal changes, so contractual terms that are laid out in the contract. Amendments to these terms and conditions, such as payment terms, warranties, or dispute resolution mechanisms. And regulatory compliance. Updates to contract requirements to comply with changes in laws or regulations. This could be something such as Davis-Bacon wage requirements, certified payroll, things like that could change, which require you to do additional work or even make it a little bit less cumbersome on you as the project develops. Personnel changes. This is something that we are all very familiar with because in today's world, it seems like we're experiencing a lot more turnover than we have ever experienced before. So staffing adjustments, changes in project personnel, such as adding or replacing team members, subcontractors, or consultants. And again, this can happen at any level, subcontractor, prime contractor, even at the government level. A change in personnel can drastically affect the momentum of the project. And key personnel retention. What provisions are there to ensure retention of key personnel critical to this project's success? And then risk allocation changes. So insurance requirements. Any changes in insurance coverage requirements or liability provisions. That could come from regulatory changes, or as the project develops, there may need to be an additional insurance requirement put onto the new scope based on what those changes look like. And then indemnification clauses. These are modifications to indemnification clauses to allocate risk between parties. Indemnification means shifting risks or potential costs from one party to another. So one party to the contract promises to defend and pay costs and expenses of the other if specific circumstances arises, often a claim or dispute with a third party to the contract. So this is where we see bonding a lot of the time, where bonding, if there's any type of requirement to pay out that bonding or to pay out the project because of subcontractor default, that's when you would have to have that bonding requirement. And again, if the project scope changes drastically, bonding and insurance processes and requirements may change along with that. And now we're going to transfer over to Trish to talk about why some of these contract changes happen in the first place.
Right, so let's get into it. So there's a lot of reasons for contract changes. And so we'll just kind of go through them little by little, and I'll give you some examples as we go along. So really one of the biggest ones is unforeseen circumstances, site conditions and technical issues, unexpected site conditions like hidden utility lines, contaminated soil, or unexpected weather conditions. An example of that, discovering an underground water pipe that wasn't in the original site plans. That's gonna lead to some of these. Technical issues, any kind of complications that arise during project execution that weren't anticipated during the planning phase. So something like incompatible software or compatibility issues with software on a tech project would be a good example of that. Client requests, so that could lead to scope additions. So the client requests additional features or functionalities that weren't included in the original scope of the project. So for instance, a client decides to add an extra room to a building project. The one thing we want to make sure that we avoid is scope creep. So what once started as a single deliverable all of a sudden becomes 5 deliverables, or a product that began with 3 essential features now has 10. Or midway through the project, the customer's needs have changed, which prompts a reassessment of the project requirements. So you really want to make sure that you're documenting these changes and getting those, because they quickly become out of hand. Next, we have design changes. So that's like errors and omissions, corrections due to mistakes or missing elements in the original design documents. So if you have to revise blueprints because of a flaw in structural calculations, that could be under there. Improvement opportunities, changes to improve the project's outcomes, such as new technology or more efficient processes. So integrating new energy efficient systems into a construction project. There's also regulatory changes. So changes in laws, regulations, or codes that make you modify the project plans. Maybe new environmental regulations have come up requiring changes to the way that you dispose of waste. Could lead to a contract change. Permitting issues, any adjustments that are required to obtain necessary permits or resolve compliance issues. So maybe there's new occupational health and safety hazard or safety regulations that now you have to implement additional safety measures that could lead to that. When there is a change order request, we like to say with DBEs, contracting of additional subs on a project, if that leads to if the change leads to necessary changes in the contract, primes typically are encouraged to utilize additional DBEs, but they're not necessarily required to do that. So that is where having developed relationships with those primes and government procurement officers is really going to pay off for you, because you want them to automatically think of you when a contract change comes about.
And so now we're going to look at the contract change management process. The biggest foot stomp here is that you are not going to want to perform any function outside of your contract or legal obligations without discussing a contract change first. So understand what you are contractually required to complete and what you are contractually obligated to do. If you perform outside of the contract, the paying agency is not contractually obligated to reimburse you outside of that contract. So it's important as a subcontractor, you always are going through your prime contractor. If your prime asks you to do something that is outside of your scope and you're expecting to be paid for that, that needs to be all solidified in writing before you start work. So this is the contract change management process that we're going to look at. Step one is the identification of a change, the actual recognition that a change needs to occur. Step two is analysis and evaluation of that change. Step three is documentation of the change request. Step four is the approval process, then implementing that change, and then review and closure. And we're going to go through each one of those here now. So the first step, identification of change. This step involves recognizing any deviations or necessary modifications to the original project plan. And this can come from either internal or external sources. So internally, it's either going to come from the project team, insights or feedback from team members who are actually working on the project, or management, a strategic decision from project managers or executives about a certain direction they want to take the future of the project in. It could also come externally. Clients and stakeholders could request a specific modification to a contract, or maybe they're getting certain feedback from the public and they want to make adjustments. Regulatory bodies, changes in laws, regulations, or industry standards could drive these changes. And then general market and industry trends. So shifts in market conditions or industry best practices may require your company or the prime to alter how they're approaching a specific element of the project. So here are some indicators that a potential change may be coming. Schedule delays, budget overruns, scope creep, stakeholder feedback. If you notice any of these occurring in your project, that may be something telling you we need to have the conversation about a change. It's either a change order, something in the contract needs to be adjusted, especially with that scope creep. It's very easy for us to add on additional work. Someone says, oh, it'd be great if we could do this, or if we could get it done at this time. it's really easy for us to be like, oh, I can do that. That's not that much work. That's not really going to cost me much more time or money. But that really builds up, especially over a long project. So scope creep is really the biggest thing we want to be worried about. We don't want to just pro bono do work for people over time on these projects, because that can actually result in a much different result when it comes to profitability. Now, early detection of change. How do we recognize these before they become problems? Regular monitor. Continuously track the project process and spot potential issues early. Maintain that strong communication with the stakeholders and key players. So frequent communication with stakeholders to gather that feedback and even anticipate changes. And then managing risks. So any proactive identification of risks that may necessitate changes. And again, a lot of this can be done even as early as the solicitation process, trying to figure out what are the possible things that could go wrong or could lead us to have to change the way that we're approaching the project. Number 2 is analysis and evaluation. So this step ensures that all aspects of changes are considered before proceeding. So what we're going to do is an impact analysis. Whenever we want to do a change, we want to know down to the most minute detail, how is this going to affect the scope, the schedule, the cost, and the quality. A way to accomplish this is by doing a feasibility study. So we're determining if the change is practical and even achievable within the project's constraints. So we're going to consider technical, financial, and operational feasibility and assess whether the team even has the skills and resources to implement the change and whether the budget can accommodate the increased or additional costs. Then we're going to do a stakeholder analysis. So identify the stakeholders who will be affected by the change, assess the impact on each of those groups, and then plan for communication and involvement. You never want to surprise people. So the communication is really key throughout this whole process. From beginning to end, there should always be updates, communication, making sure that everybody's in the loop, because that's going to avoid confusion and, a negative outcome in the long run. A cost-benefit analysis. Compare the expected benefits of the change against its cost and determine the return on investment. And lastly, a risk assessment. Identifying any potential risks that are associated with the change, evaluating the probability that this risk will even occur, and if it does, what's the impact? And then even trying to develop some mitigation strategies. Once you've assessed these are the risks that could happen, how can we prevent that from becoming a likely event to occur? So here are some tools and techniques to complete these analyses. Number 1 is a SWOT analysis, identifying the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats of the change. You can also do a PERT or CPM, which PERT is a program evaluation and review technique. It's a method of analyzing the tasks involved in completing a project, especially the time needed to complete each task, and then identifying the minimum time needed to complete the total project. Critical path method, CPM, is another way that you can schedule impact analysis and figure out how is this going to impact our schedule and our most direct path to being able to actually complete the project. Critical path method in general is the process to determine, first of all, which activities are critical, and it calculates the longest path of planned activities to the end of the project and the earliest and latest that each activity can start and finish without making the project longer. So if there's an opportunity to overlap certain tasks, that's where your CPM is going to be really beneficial. We can also use cost estimation tools, so software or methodologies for estimating the financial impact. You may have some of these developed internally, but there's also technology and subscriptions you can pay for, technology out there that can help you do this as well. And then we're going to do a risk assessment matrix. So tools for identifying and evaluating risks. You can see in the chart here, we have this XY graphic here that shows you the likelihood that an event is going to occur and the impact that it would have if it does occur. So we can really chart out what's the likelihood that a risk is going to occur, because there's going to be risk with everything we do, but it's not always very likely, especially if we have strong mitigation strategies, good communication, and really good experience to offset that. But if there is a high risk with a high impact, that's telling us that that's probably not a change order we're going to want to implement. Conversely, if something is happening in the project that has a high likelihood for a risk and a high impact, that may be a driver to have a change order. So these are the types of things we want to think about. And then documentation of this analysis. So create a comprehensive report detailing the findings of the analysis and evaluation and include all of the relevant data, assumptions, and whatever methodologies or software you use to come to those conclusions, and ensure the report is clear and accessible to all stakeholders. So this is basically a physical document that ensures everybody is on the same page, and the how we got to the decision is clearly mapped out and understood. And this can go a long way in making sure that the project has an overall positive outcome. Number 3, documentation of change requests. So documentation is important, especially in government contract. Documentation is always important. It ensures that all changes are formally recorded, which helps protect us in liability issues. Provides a clear trail of modification for future reference and accountability. And again, it's going to help with that communication and making sure that all the different stakeholders are in the loop. So here are some key elements of a change request form. Usually has a request number, the date, requester information, a description of the change, a reason for the change, the impact analysis, which is the most important part, and we're going to talk a little bit about that, priority level, what approvals or hierarchy is required, and then any supporting documentation to help, fight that claim. So that impact analysis, that's the preliminary assessment of how the change will affect the project scope, schedule, cost, and quality. So that's going to usually be a summation of all of that work we did in stage 2 to just really put on paper, this is what we think is going to happen, and this is how it's going to affect everything. So some documenting change request best practices, clarity and detail. There should be no ambiguity with how we do these. Consistency, timeliness, stakeholder involvement, and record keeping. It's important to have a record of all these documentations, again, in case things come up for liability, to make sure that we are all on the same page and we can recall this information if asked to provide that. Some common pitfalls that we see in documentation is incomplete information, a lack of standardization. So one change request form from another looks completely different. It makes it really hard to keep track, especially if there's a bunch of them. And then delayed documentation, things that aren't done in time, and that we want to get this change order in place, but it's taken so long because of a lack of standardization, which leads to a lack of processes, because of incomplete information, which leads to back and forth. Now we've delayed the documentation, we've delayed the change order, and that could have significant project issues. And we want to maintain a change request log. So that's going to typically have the ID, the date submitted, who it was submitted by, and just some general information that's going to come off of that change request form. Now, this may seem trivial or bureaucratic, but government projects operate off documentation. So you have to be able to accurately complete the documentation in a timely manner. This is an example of what that change request log looks like. You can see here, it's just got that basic information. This is something that's really helpful for the person overseeing this, especially if there's a lot of them, because you want to know what's the status of these change orders, where are we at, what's the impact. There could be large dollar amounts or large schedule changes involved, and you want to make sure if you put in a change request and then 3 weeks later that change request gets approved, you want to be able to quickly refer to how is that going to impact the project. If you have one project, you're going to be pretty in tune with it. But depending on your company and the season, you may be in the middle of 5 or 6 different projects and trying to figure out what was that one change request for that one project that we were trying to do. This really helps organize your thoughts and keeps you on track. So the next step is to obtain formal approval from relevant stakeholders. The approval process ensures that all parties are in agreement with the proposed changes and its associated impacts. And again, it's going to ensure that everybody is fully expecting and understanding what's about to happen. So the first part of this is an established approval hierarchy. Again, if you're a subcontractor, this isn't really going to be in your domain. You're actually going to be just providing information to the prime, or if you are involved, you just have to know what the process is or ask the question. You're not really the one who's developing the hierarchy. But understanding who the key stakeholders are and who needs to approve the changes is important, especially if you're the one that wants to do the change order. It's helpful to know what kind of chain of command does this have to go up and down to be approved. We want to determine the appropriate level of authority required for the approval, the process for escalating unresolved issues or disagreements, and what's the criteria that must be met for approval. Documentation of approval. Again, right back to documentation. There should be a formal document tracking change order submissions, status, and approval for future references and audit purposes. Efficient approval workflows and communication channels streamline the process, and they minimize delays. So whenever any change order does get approved, you want that documentation, again, to show that, to have that, and you want to save that record in case it needs to come up in the future. Or if you work on a similar project with a similar agency or prime, it's a good document to refer back to. The next step is implementation of the change into the project. So implementation involves executing the necessary tasks to incorporate the improved changes while trying to minimize disruption to the project process at the same time. So we're going to assign tasks and allocate resources. And that's just that. It's assigning specific tasks related to the change request to the team members, and then ensuring that we have enough resources, materials, equipment, manpower to allocate and support that process. We're going to adjust the timeline. We're going to reevaluate the project timeline to make sure that it's still going to be able to be met with the new change implementations, or if not, we need to adjust that. Any contract changes or timeline changes should be communicated to all the team members, to all the stakeholders, to manage expectations and then maintain that transparency. That's not lastly. Let me try that again. I just saw that there's the next slide has 4 and 5.
Oh.
The next step is to track budgeting cost. So we're going to track expenses related to the implementation of the change and compare those costs against the original approved budget. And then implement cost control measures to prevent budget overruns and ensure financial accountability. Then we're going to communicate the status of that change. So notifying the clients, the team members, any other key stakeholders about the completion of the change implementation. We're going to provide updates on the progress of the change and how that affects the project deliverables or milestones down the line. And last but not least, document the implementation process. So we want to have a record of all the tasks that were performed, the resources that were required to perform those tasks, and any challenges that we encountered along the way. And again, we want to ensure the documentation is accurate, comprehensive, and accessible for reference. Review and closure activities ensure that the change has been successfully integrated into the project and that all the documentation is complete. So for reviewing, we're going to conduct a thorough review of the change implementation process to assess its effectiveness and the impact on the project. And that involves comparing the actual outcomes against the expected benefits, and then identifying any lessons learned and best practices for future project improvements. In closure, we're verifying that all the documentation that we've been doing related to the change request is accurate and is complete and it is distributed to who needs to have that. So all the signatures and approvals have been obtained. We're formally closing out the request by updating the documentation records, and we're communicating the status of that closure to all of the key players as well. And the importance of documentation, why do we need to do it? Why is it so strict? Why do we have to get all these signatures? Is for audit reasons, and then developing historical data to compete with larger firms. So if we have this information internally, we're going to be more effective in how we do business and ultimately how we can compete against our competition. So let's look at some common challenges and mitigation strategies as they relate to these change orders. Common challenge is lack of clear communication. And we can overcome that by implementing a structured communication plan, regular updates, and clear documentation. So having a clear chain of command and knowing that when you say something to a prime, that prime is going to eventually report that to the contract owner, who's going to report that to other key stakeholders, constituents involved into the process as well. Inadequate documentation is another common challenge. To fix that, we use standardized change request forms and centralized document management systems. That way, if there's a standardized form, there's a standardized process. Once you learn the process, there's a much less likelihood that it's going to be done incorrectly. And then a centralized system keeps all of the documents in a place where everybody has access to it. Stakeholder resistance. One way we can overcome this is by engaging with stakeholders early, communicating the benefits, and addressing concerns through open discussions. So again, that transparency is really important here. Scope creep. Employ strict control procedures, clear scope definitions, and stakeholder agreement on these scope changes. So by understanding even what scope creep is or how it happens, we can employ factors to prevent it from happening. And then cost overruns. Execute a detailed cost impact analysis, contingency plan, and budget tracking. There's only so much we can do about planning for cost before once the project gets started and things inevitably happen. But the more we detail that out and we look at that impact analysis, the more likely we are to adapt to changes in the cost. Delays in the schedule. If we conduct comprehensive schedule impact analysis and set realistic timelines, that's a good way to avoid this too. Similar to the cost, this is something you want to do early and kind of plan out these contingency actions in case there's project delays. If you have multiple projects going on at once, or you need project A to finish by a certain time so you can get your crew and equipment to project B, and you're buttoned right up against those project times, that's going to pose a problem if project A gets delayed. So you want to make sure you have strategies in place throughout your whole season of projects to make sure that you're not overburdening yourself or putting yourself in a position where you're not going to be able to complete all of your projects. Insufficient risk management. This can be implemented through risk assessment, developing risk management plans, and then monitoring the status and the likelihood of these risks continuously. Quality control issues. Internally, we need to undergo rigorous quality assurance processes, regular quality checks, and stakeholder sign-offs. A lot of this stuff can be mitigated by really strong training programs and making sure that we don't have any quality control issues in the first place. Resource constraints. Prioritize change and plan resources usage accordingly. Now, complex approval processes, depending on who you're working with, that chain of command may get really out of control. And you may want to do a change order and say, by the time this goes up, gets approved, comes back down, we're going to be done with the project. So how do we overcome that? We want to streamline those approval workflows, identify the roles and responsibilities, and delegate authorities. So having that open communication with the prime, if that's where this process is starting, right up front, saying that I'm concerned about the timeline of this change order going through. And if there's a question, how long is it going to take for that question to come back? Then send up an answer, and send another question, and we can't get it done. So by having that transparency, letting your prime or letting the contract owner know that these are your concerns, you can a lot of times expedite the process and even get multiple individuals in that hierarchy involved in the same step. And lastly, integration issues. So this is after we decide that we have the change order, it's approved, how do we integrate it? So by performing that impact analysis, integration testing, and phased implementation. So depending on what the change order is, we may not need to do all of it right away. We may be able to phase it in little by little, and that's going to help offset the impact of the schedule delay, the cost, the allocating resources as well.
So looking at the challenges that kind of come in ways that you can mitigate that, one of the important things to do is really have outlined roles and responsibilities. So let's look at that. So depending on the business that you're in and that you run, you may have several roles that one person is doing, but these are really the essential functions in the contract change process. So you've got your project manager, your project team members, the change control board, the client and customer, any stakeholders, sponsors, the QA team, the finance manager, and the documentation specialist. And again, this may be one person doing several of these roles, but we'll look at what each of those roles should do. So a project manager is the person that ensures that changes are thoroughly evaluated. They keep the project on time and within budget. They also act as the central point of communication in the change order process, and they coordinate with stakeholders to manage expectations and approvals throughout the whole process. The project manager then mitigates those risks and ensures that changes are documented and comply with contractual obligations and safeguards the project's overall success. So really, the responsibilities of a project manager are to facilitate the identification and documentation of change requests, conduct or coordinate the analysis and evaluation of change requests, communicate with stakeholders to ensure alignment and transparency, seek necessary approvals and ensure that the change request process follows the established protocols, monitor and control the implementation of approved changes, and then maintain accurate records and documentations throughout the process while ensuring timely and effective closure of change orders. Next are your project team members. They're crucial in the process because they're the ones who provide the technical expertise and the insights that ensure that proposed changes are feasible and that they align with project goals. Their input is going to help assess the impact of changes on specific tasks, timelines, and quality, which enables you then to create an accurate planning and execution plan. Team members are also the ones that help implement those changes, and they ensure that your project is able to adapt smoothly while maintaining its overall integrity. So really, your team members are their responsibilities are to identify potential changes and risks during project execution, provide technical and domain expertise in evaluating change requests, assist in the implementation of approved changes by executing assigned tasks. They participate in the quality assurance and testing of those implemented changes, and then they provide feedback and report on the status of changes during implementation. So a lot of projects will have a change control board. This is a group of stakeholders who review and approve or reject change requests. They provide a structured and objective process for evaluating and approving or rejecting those requests, and they ensure that only necessary and beneficial changes are implemented. They help maintain project alignment with the strategic goals of the project by really looking at the impact of the change on the scope, the cost, and the schedule. It helps to ensure that all stakeholders are represented in the decision-making process, promoting transparency and reducing the likelihood of disputes in the project timeline. So their responsibilities really are to evaluate the impact and feasibility of change requests, approve or reject the changes based on the set criteria and project objectives, ensure that approved changes align with the project goals and the constraints of the project, provide guidance and support during the implementation of changes, and they review post-implementation results and lessons learned. Here's the big one, the client and customer. So the clients or customers provide approval and funding for the changes, ensuring that the project continues to meet their evolving needs and expectations. Their input helps prioritize what changes are most valuable and which align with the project outcomes and objectives that you're aiming for. Additionally, if you involve the clients in the change process, it fosters that attitude of transparency and trust and reduces the risk of misunderstandings or dissatisfaction. So really, you want your customers to propose changes based on evolving needs and feedback. You want them to participate in the evaluation and approval of change requests, provide requirements and expectations for proposed changes, review and approve the final implementation of changes, and then provide feedback on the change management process and outcomes so that you can make changes as you need to. Next are the stakeholders. A lot like customers, stakeholders are important in the process because they offer diverse perspectives from each angle of the project. They help to assess the broader impact of changes on the project's success, and their involvement ensures that changes align with the interests of all parties affected by the project. They facilitate a smoother implementation and minimize resistance to changes because, again, they're tackling that from all sides of the change. Additionally, if you engage all the stakeholders in the change management process, it enhances communication and collaboration in the process and reduces the risk of conflicts and ensures that the project remains on track. So you really want your stakeholders to communicate openly about their needs, their concerns, and feedback regarding potential changes, participate and be active participants in discussions and evaluations of change requests, support the project team in implementing changes by providing the necessary resources or approvals as needed, and then monitor the impact of changes and provide feedback. A lot of these, that's exactly what you need, is the feedback. So sponsors, these are senior executives or managers who provide the financial and strategic support of the project. Sponsors provide the necessary authority and the resources that fund these changes. So it ensures that the project can adapt to new requirements. Their oversight helps align change decisions with the organization's overall goals, ensuring that the project remains relevant and valuable. Additionally, your sponsors are going to advocate for the project at higher levels, which is going to secure the support needed to implement the changes effectively. So you want your sponsors to authorize and allocate resources for approved changes, provide strategic direction, and ensure changes align with the business, resolve escalations or conflicts related to change requests, communicate the importance and benefits of changes to higher management or external parties. Then you want to get your quality assurance team involved. They're going to ensure that the implemented changes meet the required quality standards for the project. They are going to enhance the project's quality standards. That's going to help prevent any defects or issues down the road with quality. They're the experts that help identify potential quality risks associated with any potential changes that you're making. And it allows for a proactive approach to making those adjustments to processes or materials as you go. The QA team also validates that the implemented changes actually meet the required specifications, ensuring that the final deliverable aligns with the client expectations and the industry standards. So your QA team is going to develop and execute testing plans for changes. They're going to identify and report any defects or issues they see during those testing phases. They're going to verify that any changes do not negatively impact existing functionalities or deliverables. And they're going to provide feedback and documentation on their results. Next, we have the finance manager. This is the person who manages the final financial aspects related to changes specifically. They evaluate the financial impact of changes, ensure that the project remains within budget, or identifies the need for additional funding if it's required. They provide a detailed cost analysis and help the team make informed decisions about the feasibility and prioritization of changes. The finance manager also ensures that all financial aspects of change orders are accurately documented and aligned with the organization's financial policies and goals. So you want your finance manager to really assess the cost implications of your proposed changes, monitor and control the budgets related to change implementations, approve financial expenditures for changes within allocated budgets, and report on the financial status of changes to stakeholders. And then lastly, we have our documentation specialist. This is the person that ensures that all documentation related to changes is accurate and up to date. So they are the ones who accurately record and provide a clear and traceable history of product modifications throughout the project. You want this person to be meticulous in their documentation so that it supports compliance with contractual obligations and legal requirements and reduces the risk of disputes. You want them to, they can actually help facilitate communication because they maintain an organized and accessible document library and accessible records, which is going to enable your stakeholders to easily reference change details and understand their impact on the project. So you really want this person to maintain records of change requests, approvals, and implementations, ensure that all documentation follows standardized formats and procedures, provide access to change order documentation for stakeholders as needed, and assist in preparing reports and documentation for post-implementation review. Really having these roles and responsibilities outlined is an important part of the change process. So you want to make sure that even if you're fulfilling multiple roles, that you're able to do a lot of these responsibilities.
That's right. And most of the roles are just that. They're not necessarily jobs or positions. It's a role. So you may be the finance manager during that portion, and then you're going to be the documentation specialist during that portion. So going back and reviewing these, depending on which stage of the change order you're at, can be helpful. Now, lastly, we're going to look at actually controlling these contract changes. So what can we do? And we're going to look at how we can control the cost, time, our minimal involvement in legal considerations, and then some negotiation techniques, which can help us either get a change order done faster or help us prove our point as to maybe why a change order wouldn't be in the best interest of the project. And so we'll start with cost management. So identify and document costs. So this is the initial cost estimate. So when we document the initial cost estimate of the project included allocated contingency funds, it helps us prepare for any changes in the cost. And then the change request cost estimate. We're providing a detailed estimate of the cost associated with these change requests, including the direct and indirect cost. And then again, the impact analysis of that cost. So a cost impact analysis identifies how the cost will change during this. What are the additional costs or cost savings or any shifts in resource allocation? A breakdown of all the costs. So an itemized list of the labor, materials, equipment, or any other relevant categories that go into effect. And then even painting the scenario, painting the picture of here's the best case or the worst case and most likely scenarios so that you can fully understand the range of the potential cost impacts. In the approval process for approval and documentation, ensures that all cost estimates and final impacts are reviewed and approved by the appropriate stakeholders, which can include the financial managers in that CCB or the Change Control Board. And lastly, of course, you're going to see documentation forever and always record all financial approvals and changes in the project documentation for transparency, audit purposes, or even future reference. So here are some best practices to actually manage the costs. Number one is an EVM, so earned value management. We can apply these EVM techniques to assess project performance and progress in terms of cost and schedule. So EVM measures project performance by providing accurate measurements of scope, time, and costs. So it's similar to a work in progress report or a WIP. Calculating the key metrics such as cost variance or the cost performance impact index CPI to evaluate the final financial impact of these change requests. What the hell is this saying?
What? Were you even talking English?
Okay, I'm ready to go back in this. So you'll see a couple formula. Hold on, let me write down. I saw to make that edit. When I go back and edit this, I have to watch the whole thing unless I write down where there was a mistake, so then I can go back and. So far, we've had five edits to make, which is fine.
That's not bad.
No. So you'll see a couple formulas here. CV equals EV minus AC. So that's the cost variance. And that's going to be our earned value, which is the budgeted cost for the work that has actually been completed, minus the actual cost, which represents the actual cost incurred for the work completed. So we take what our earned value is, subtract that from the actual cost, and that's going to give us our cost variance. Cost variance is a good metric that we can use to either fight for or fight against a change. We also have CPI, that cost performance index, and that's going to be your earned value divided by your actual cost. And again, that's another metric that we can use to prove our point. Contingency planning, allocating contingency funds to manage unforeseen costs. So if we have funds allocated to a contingency pool of money that we can use on a project, that's going to help us control any cost changes on a project. And we want to regularly review and adjust that contingency reserve based on the project, emerging costs, and what else we have going on in our companies. Regular monitoring and reporting. So continuously monitoring the financial status of the project, such as a WIP report, and report on cost performance regularly. Using dashboards and financial reports to keep stakeholders and ourselves informed. Again, these dashboards, these financial reports, these can all be created internally. You could be using a software system that does this for you, but you just want to make sure that you're tracking it so you can anticipate any cost changes that are going to happen and what the impact of those is going to be. So how can we control time management cost changes? Again, we're going to do an impact analysis to determine how a change request will affect the project schedule, including accelerating or delaying the process. Task dependencies. So we're identifying dependencies affected by the change to fully understand the full scope and the schedule impact. So if we change something that's going to affect something else, we want to make sure that we had identified that and documented that, and so that we know exactly how we're going to go about fixing that process. And then that critical path analysis. We talked about the critical path method earlier, but we're determining if the change request will affect the project's critical path and overall completion date. Identifying dependencies affected by the change to fully understand the full scope and the schedule impact. So if we change something that's going to affect something else, we want to make sure that we had identified that and documented that, and so that we know exactly how we're going to go about fixing that process. And then that critical path analysis. We talked about the critical path method earlier, but we're determining if the change request will affect the project's critical path and overall completion date. What is going on over there?
Sorry, hold on. I answered my call instead of declining it on my watch. So my son or whoever that was talking to me. But no, sorry.
Worse. You have to call him back right now?
No, I'm sure he's okay. All right, I'm good now. I thought I had my stuff silenced, but it comes through on my watch.
That's okay.
It's fine. We're fine. Okay. We should be good now.
All right. I'll take it from number 2 here. We're almost done, thank God. So number 2, approval and scheduling. The approval process. Ensuring that all schedule impacts are reviewed and approved by those relevant stakeholders in the change control board, and scheduling adjustments, updating the project schedule to reflect approved changes, including start and end dates for new modified tasks. And lastly, the way we can help affect time management costs changes or time, oh, geez, let me change that again. That was all over the place. And lastly, resource planning. So resource allocation, planning and allocating resources needed to implement change requests, considering availability and workload. And then resource leveling. This is adjusting resource assignments to avoid overloading team members and ensuring a balancing workload. So as a time constraint may come into play, having resource leveling across our different projects, our different, our teams, our equipment, that's having a plan for that before we start the project is going to help us adapt and change and be fluid to the project as it changes. So some best practices of these is to identify that critical path method, apply CPM to identify the longest sequence of tasks, and use that to understand how changes affect the critical path and the overall project duration. There's also agile and iterative approaches. So for projects using agile methodologies, and agile methodologies are sets of principles, practices that emphasize flexibility, collaboration, rapid delivery, and continuous improvement. So in other words, if it's an agile type project or you're doing agile logistics, it's really talking about a very fluid, adaptive approach to work. So when we're using these methodologies, incorporating change requests into the iterative planning cycle. The iterative planning cycle is repetitive cycles of planning, execution, and review. So we figure out we want to do something, we plan it, we execute it, we review it, and then we just keep doing that over and over again as every new change order comes up, and that's part of what makes an agile approach so agile. Use sprint planning and backlog prioritization to manage changes with short, manageable iterations. So sometimes if we don't want to go through that whole process, we can do sprint planning, which basically accelerates that process, and it helps us adjust how much time it's going to take. So by doing a sprint planning approach in an agile methodology project, we can actually increase the speed, and at the the end of that, it doesn't take as much time, and that's how we can control the time. Legal considerations. So here's some example clauses for contract changes. And again, this isn't something that is as important for you. This is going to be more at the contract owner or prime level, unless you are the prime. So these are some general things that you're going to typically see as the legal jargon. Change order submission clause, cost and payment adjustment clause, and dispute resolution clause. And again, this is just the boilerplate legal jargon that you may come across or may want to make sure is included. We always recommend that you always seek out professional legal assistance if you're doing something that could come back on a contract or question the validity of that clause. Always seek out legal assistance when necessary, or at least talk to the prime contractor or the contract owner to see what's going to be required. There are some common legal issues that usually can arise in contract changes. Number one, unauthorized changes. So this is why we want to make sure that all of them are approved and documented properly, because this is where we want to make sure if something gets called into question, we can provide that document saying we had the authority to go ahead and do this. Ambiguities in scope. So without having a detailed and clear description of the scope, that can lead to common legal issues. Cost discrepancies. To counter this, we agree on cost in writing before implementing these changes and include a detailed cost breakdowns. That's why that impact analysis is so important. All of that work that we do at the front end prevents these considerations from even happening. Finally, the schedule conflict, clearly documenting any schedule changes and agreeing on new deadlines with all parties involved. And again, these changes should be in a centralized location where everybody has access to it and nobody has the excuse of I wasn't notified. Some best practices with these is to get that legal review and advice. So involve legal counsel in the change request process, especially when it comes to high dollars or very large changes to the project. And ensure all contractual documents are legally sound and protect the interest of all parties involved. And then regular audits and compliance check. So conduct regular audits of the change request process to ensure compliance with contractual and legal requirements. And then implement or compliance check to identify and address any potential legal issues early. So just like we're keeping a vigilant eye out for changes in cost, changes in scope, changes in schedule, we want to make sure that we're making sure we're following along with any compliance checks or audit requirements. And this is going to go back to that roles and responsibility, that QA role is making sure that we are doing everything that we're supposed to be doing to avoid having any legal issues towards the end of the project or even during the project. That clause, always seek out legal assistance when necessary, or at least talk to the prime contractor or the contract owner to see what's going to be required. There are some common legal issues that usually can arise in contract changes. Number one, unauthorized changes. So this is why we want to make sure that all of them are approved and documented properly, because this is where we want to make sure if something gets called into question, we can provide that document saying we had the authority to go ahead and do this. Ambiguities in scope. So without having a detailed and clear description of the scope, that can lead to common legal issues. Cost discrepancies. To counter this, we agree on cost in writing before implementing these changes and include a detailed cost breakdowns. That's why that impact analysis is so important. All of that work that we do at the front end prevents these considerations from even happening. Finally, the schedule conflict, clearly documenting any schedule changes and agreeing on new deadlines with all parties involved. And again, these changes should be in a centralized location where everybody has access to it and nobody has the excuse of I wasn't notified. Some best practices with these is to get that legal review and advice. So involve legal counsel in the change request process, especially when it comes to high dollars or very large changes to the project. And ensure all contractual documents are legally sound and protect the interest of all parties involved. And then regular audits and compliance check. So conduct regular audits of the change request process to ensure compliance with contractual and legal requirements. And then implement or compliance check to identify and address any potential legal issues early. So just like we're keeping a vigilant eye out for changes in cost, changes in scope, changes in schedule, we want to make sure that we're following along with any compliance checks or audit requirements. And this is going to go back to that roles and responsibility, that QA role is making sure that we are doing everything that we're supposed to be doing to avoid having any legal issues towards the end of the project or even during the project. So lastly here, we're going to talk about negotiation. I like to say that negotiation is just a conversation with desired results. So some elements of negotiation here are that we want to be creative and flexible. My whole thing is going all over the place here. All my slides are just disappearing. I'm trying to pull them back up while talking.
What happened?
All right, let me just start at this slide. I'll slide that over again. So the last thing we're going to be talking about here is some negotiation techniques. Negotiation is just a conversation with desired results. So before we go into a negotiation, we want to prepare. We want to gather that information. So collect relevant data and documentation related to the change requests, including scope changes, cost estimates, schedule impact, the impact analysis. We want to understand the interest of all the parties and make sure that all the parties are involved in the negotiation with the intent of finding that common ground. And most importantly is define the goals, setting clear objectives and desired outcomes for the negotiation. including what are our acceptable limits for scope changes, cost changes, schedule adjustments. And then communication, active listening. Listen attentively to the concerns and perspectives of the other party to understand their needs and interests. Most of negotiating is listening and not speaking. Where people fail at negotiations is when they're trying to force their ideas or their interest down the other party's throats. So by actively listening and hearing in between the lines of what the other party is saying, we can get a lot more out of a negotiation. Clarity and transparency. Clearly communicating our interests, concerns, and proposed solutions to facilitate open and constructive dialogue. We want to be direct, but we want to be respectful. We don't want to leave any ambiguity of what we're looking for or what the outcomes should be. And ask questions. Seek clarifications and ask probing questions to gain deeper insight into the other party's position and reasoning. If somebody says, no, they don't want to do that, or that's a bad idea, we want to ask why. What experiences do they have? What about that is a bad idea? Why is that cost not adding up to you? Or why is that delay in schedule not seeming like a worthy interest to take on? Sometimes if we can get the why behind what the issue is, we can actually find another solution. So, and we do that by asking calibrated questions, which are basically questions that the other side can respond to that have no fixed answer. These are open-ended questions. So something like, well, how am I supposed to fund that? You know, a bad way to look at something is this something you would like, or is this something you can afford? Because that's going to lead somebody to yes or no. You're not really getting any more information out of a yes or no. But if you propose a contract change and you say something along the lines of, what about this would be beneficial for you? Or what is the biggest challenge you face with this idea? That's going to open up a lot more conversation. You're going to get a lot more information from that person. We also want to practice tactical empathy. So what's interesting is that psychotherapy shows us that when individuals feel listened to, they tend to listen to themselves more carefully, and they openly evaluate and clarify their own thoughts and feelings. And we see that sometimes where somebody just needs to talk about something and then they come to their own solution and you don't have to say anything. That is a very powerful technique to use in negotiations, is you want someone to feel that they're being listened to so that they open up more, and sometimes they can even solve their own problems or come to terms with what you're trying to get them to come to terms with. So with negotiations, we want to be creative and we want to be flexible. So brainstorm solutions, encourage that creative problem-solving process, explore alternative solutions that meets the needs of both parties. The person on the other end of the table is going to appreciate if you're willing to meet them halfway and talk about different options. And again, be flexible. Compromise where you need to, where it's going to have higher payouts in the long run, and adapt your position to find mutually beneficial outcomes in considering the much larger picture. Sometimes with the change order, we get so focused on the specific thing we're trying to change, we forget about the big picture. So make sure that you're tying in what your goals are to how this is going to affect the overall project. Negotiation tactics. There's a win-win approach. So we want to strive for outcomes that benefit both parties and enhance the overall project success. At the same time, negotiation is a fantastic opportunity to build rapport, to establish that positive and collaborative relationship with the other party. And you can show how professional and how in your interpersonal skills, which can lead to future work and wanting a company to work with you again. The opposite is also true. If you have bad negotiations or you're too aggressive, too argumentative, it's unlikely that you're going to open up more opportunities with this company. Remember that specifically when we're subcontractors and we're burning bridges with multiple different prime contractors. There's usually not a lot of primes in a state that are, bidding on actively on a lot of projects, and they talk to each other. So it's really easy to get a bad reputation as a subcontractor. So when we go to a negotiation table or we have a dispute, it's incredibly important to be professional, because even at the end of the day, if you don't agree, there's a lot to be said about two parties that are able to communicate efficiently in a professional manner. And then we're going to focus on interests, not positions. So look beyond the stated positions and focus on underlying interest. So this is saying, like, if someone's saying, I'm a prime, so you have to listen to me, we're not looking at what position you're in. We're looking at trying to find solutions that address the core concern. So know where you're at. At the same time, don't undervalue yourself if you're a subcontractor. Don't think I have no say in this. You absolutely do, especially if they're asking to do a change order or asking you to do something that's going outside of your scope. So some best practices with negotiations is always use facts and figures. So present actual factual data and evidence to support your position. Use benchmarking, compare your proposed changes to industry standards, benchmarks, or similar projects to justify those needs. Prioritize the elements of the change orders, such as critical scope requirements or budget constraints. And then trade-offs. So propose those trade-offs or compromises in one area. It could be the scope, it could be the cost, the schedule, the technical, and that helps offset the changes in another area and maintain overall project balance. Joint problem solving. Again, that's just working collaboratively to brainstorm solutions. Value creation, look for opportunities to create additional value through innovative solutions and process improvements. Maintaining that professionalism and focusing on that long-term relationship. So again, having that professional relationship with another person, even if you disagree, can still lead to future work and a better reputation. The last thing we're going to talk about today is handling difficult situations. So managing conflict. We want to de-escalate if we realize that a negotiation or even just a relationship with another company is starting to get out of control. We can use techniques such as active listening, empathy, and reframing to diffuse tense situations and promote that constructive dialogue. We also want to employ proven conflict resolution strategies such as meditation or arbitration. That's mediation. We also want to employ some proven conflict resolution strategies, such as mediation or arbitration, to address impasses and find mutually acceptable options. Sometimes it's better to bring in a third party, an arbitrator or a mediator, to help navigate the concerns if there's too much hostility between the two companies. And then dealing with power imbalances. So if we are over-leveraged, if we are overpowered and we don't feel like that we have any say, there are some ways that we can overcome that as well. Seek support from other stakeholders or project team members to strengthen our negotiating position and help balance out those dynamics. So if you're going to a certain company and maybe you're the sub of a sub and you're not able to kind of clear your point and you're doing things inefficiently, maybe you can go to the prime directly and say, okay, here's the issues. This is costing money. This is dangerous. And we can't continue on this way. Now you kind of balance the scale a little bit because now you have the prime on your side as well. And leverage alternatives. Identify and leverage alternative options or alternatives to strengthen your negotiation position and increase bargaining power. So that was a lot of information. Contract changes are not the most exciting topic, but they do happen all the time. And no matter what line of work you're in or how long you've been in business, these are going to continuously come up. No project can be fully prepared for, especially at the design level. Things are going to come up on the job site, and it's important at whatever level your company's involved, as the prime, as the sub of a sub, it's important that you understand the tactics and the approach that you're going to take when dealing with these issues. And with that, that is the conclusion of our 4-part training series. So thank you to everybody who has participated in any of our trainings. We really appreciate it. If there's any information that you need from us, if you have any questions about contract changes or any of the previous trainings as well, please do not hesitate to reach out and contact us. That's what we're here for. We're happy and we're proud to be the South Dakota DD Supportive Services provider, and we're here for you. So please use us as a resource, and we hope to hear from you soon and work with you soon. Thank you.
Hi, everybody.